Hey, hello, hi, everyone. Welcome to and or back to the EquiTheory podcast. I am your host, Jill Treese. And this week's episode, we have a wonderful guest, and I am so very excited for you guys to hear this episode. All honesty here, I thought this was going to be an hour tops, and this episode ended up going on for over 2 hours. And that's not including the time that me and Sonja talked off air. But yes, so the guest is Sonja from Saddlefit for Life, and she is a global education coordinator and an individual who knows an awful lot about saddles and research. And she is the person that I've been in contact with and had several conversations about for me doing their certified equine ergonomist course. So I've had a few conversations with her and she's helped me out a lot. And I was like, what if you came on my podcast and helped out everyone else? So I asked you guys on Instagram to send me some questions, and boy, did you guys not hold back. But I am planning on having a few more guests on to talk about Saddlefit and how important it is, as well as a bunch of the little minute details. So this is more of an overview, a generalized introduction to some things you need to consider about saddles and saddle fitting. So hopefully you guys find this episode entertaining and you enjoy it. And yeah, be sure to check out Saddlefit for Life. Sonja doesn't have any social media that she wants to promote other than just the brand. So be sure to give that a check out. And yeah, let's get into it. Alrighty guys, I actually lied. I got to do a little self-promo here for a sec. If you are interested in learning more about training your horse and or positive reinforcement, or you have a very niche topic that you'd like to know more about, I have several of those, all of that information categorized and available up on my website, jetequitheory.com. And beyond that, we got social media, we got Instagram, we got YouTube, we got Twitter, we got Facebook, TikTok even. All of that you can find under Jet EquiTheory, and the podcast is on some of those under EquiTheory. So you can follow along to keep up with me and the horses, as well as be updated when there are new episodes that go live. So beyond that, I also have the Patreon. So if you would like to get any training advice from me, training or behavioral consulting, that is a service I offer on my Patreon. I'm working on getting it up independently on my website, but it's taking me a little bit. But yeah, so all of that is there, and merch is coming soon. I'm redoing it all. It'll be up soon on the Jet EquiTheory site, and you won't have to go to any other website for that. It'll be up just on my website. So that's all coming. We got a few horses for sale if you're interested in that. And beyond that, that's it. So let's get Sonja on the line. All right, guys, I have Sonja on the line here. Say hello.
Hi.
Okay, so would you mind giving the listeners an idea of who on earth you are and what you do?
Yeah, no problem. So my name is Sonja. I work for Saddlefit for Life. We are a global educator on saddle fitting. And what I do is help develop the curriculum. I write the Facebook posts. I provide student support and pretty much a little bit of everything.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so how did you get into all of that? Because we've known each other for a little while because I'm taking the Saddlefit for Life course, which is incredibly comprehensive. Oh my God, the Certified Equine Ergonomist course. And I wonder, how did you get into saddle fitting and the research side of it? Was there a particular case that sparked your interest?
So it's actually a funny story. The reason I found Saddlefit for Life was the same reason that the founder founded Saddlefit for Life.
Interesting.
I have a very difficult to fit thoroughbred mare. She has massive withers, a tiny little saddle support area, and I need a 17, 18-inch saddle.
Feel you there.
I started looking around for saddles. Nothing fit. I went through, I don't even know how many fitters. Mm-hmm. And finally, I discovered Saddlefit for Life. And they were looking for someone to sort of digitize their education, bring them into sort of the next generation of delivering education. And that's how we sort of came together. And the research part of it came when, I told them about my interest in anatomy and biomechanics and in really furthering our education and how comprehensive it was, and working with veterinarians, people who specifically do dissections. And that led me to sort of travel around testing saddles with a whole bunch of different equipment and, adding it to our course to just make it bigger and better constantly.
Mm-hmm. I relate to that so much. I also have that shark fin, short-backed thoroughbred mare, and will let you know instantly if she's uncomfortable in any way, shape, or form. So, yeah, that's awesome. I don't even know how you picked an area, because in working with horses, and I'm like, okay, I'm going to start with hoof care. And then I'm like, oh, but nope, you can't do that without nutrition. Let me get into training. Oh, can't do that without knowing everything about anatomy and saddle fit. Like, how did you pick just the one area? Is that just how life took you?
I guess it was one of the easiest ones to fix. So when you're talking about farrier or nutrition or, oh my God, even training,
Mm-hmm.
you can spend a lifetime explaining it to someone, and
Right.
until they feel it, they experience it, they ride it, they really don't get it. But for saddle fitting, it's so easy to fix.
Right. And it's very
Like
visual
saddle
too.
saddle doesn't fit, find another one.
Right.
Like it's simple, but I mean, obviously you've taken the course. It's not quite as simple as that.
Dear God,
but it's
no.
a lot easier to change out someone's saddle than it is to change their whole preconception of how a horse needs to be trained.
Right. Of course. That and the nutrition and the hoof care. I mean, I don't know. Now that I'm thinking about it, there is so many misconceptions about every facet of horses. And, obviously my podcast is a positive reinforcement training geared podcast. So I spend 90% of my time talking about misconceptions. So I have a feeling you relate in that regard, that there's just so much information out there that gets bogged down in marketing tactics. And then you're just like, the poor owners and riders are like, what do I do? I don't know. I thought this was right and it's not. So,
yeah, unfortunately.
Yeah, and I think it's awesome what you guys do, that you're trying to make that education more accessible and actually educate people with research, and not just, oh yeah, the horse seems fine. So that's a big part.
And that's the difference with our company, is if someone comes to us and says, hey, I found new evidence that kind of contradicts what you're teaching, is like, yes, show it to us, let us read it, give us more, and then we change. We change with, with evidence that gets brought to the surface, with new techniques on research. We don't just stick to our guns like, no, this is how we do it, and we're not changing. That's the difference. We evolve constantly, because it's not about ego. It's not about money. It's not about, our brand even. It's about helping the horse, full stop.
Right. Yeah, and I that's why when you reached out to me and gave me the elevator pitch on the brand, I was like, yep, this is something that I'm very interested in, because when we first talked, shared a lot of the same values on just trying to make the world a better place for horses with research, evidence, and science, rather than conventional wisdom and just, winging it, I guess.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, so is there anything else you want to say before we dive into these questions? We got so many.
No, I know we have so many questions, so I say let's just jump right in.
All right, let's do it. So, as you guys, the listeners, know, I asked a bunch of you on Instagram what you would like to know about saddle fitting, and I got over 50 questions. And I have a document in front of me that organizes about 45 of them, because a lot of them were repeats, of course. And unfortunately, we're not going to be able to cover everything, though I think me and Sonja would both really love to do that. We had a hard time deciding which would be, the most pertinent ones to at least kick off a potential series on saddle fit would be. So, of course, the first one has to be, Sonja, what is your ideal saddle setup? What does it look like?
So in regards to saddle setup, ideally it fits horse and rider perfectly equally. And that's the thing. I have a lot of riders who will put the comfort of the horse first and will suffer the pain and the discomfort and the imbalance of riding in a saddle that's not suited to them, not understanding or realizing that an imbalanced rider negatively affects a horse. So if you have, for example, someone riding on your shoulders and that person's wiggling around nonstop, you will never be able to walk a straight line.
Right.
Yet we expect our horses to be able to go in straight lines, remain balanced, shift their weight to the hind while we're up there like a sack of potatoes just flopping around.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I feel like equestrians do tend to have a little bit of martyrdom going on. We're always like, yeah, I'll get my horse chiropracted and physio and the vet visits and all of these supplements and make sure their nutrition is perfect. And then we look at our houses and it's just in complete disarray. And we're like, I can't remember the last time I showered.
I mean, it's not uncommon to have a rider like measure out all the supplements for their horse, make sure everything's organic, top of the line, and then the rider, eats a sandwich that has fallen on the barn floor.
Yes, I am guilty of this. Before I started like having a food delivery service, I was like, mac and cheese sounds good, and those cups for children. I'll do that for dinner.
Yes.
But I need to make sure my horse has a low NSC diet and has her gut supplements and her CBD, whatnot, and like just, I really think that that's something that has to change in the industry. And I think that what you guys are doing is a great step in that direction because you're bringing more and more awareness all the time to how important it is that riders also consider themselves. Because like you said, even if you buy the best saddle on the market for your horse, if it doesn't work for you, then your horse is still going to suffer.
Yeah. And I mean, of all the fitters that I had out, not a single one took any measurements of me. Not one.
Yeah, that's not good. I remember when I got my first quote unquote custom saddle, they took the measurement of my femur and that was about it. And I was like, okay, that's good enough, I guess. And then, I see companies like Schlese out there doing butt molds and I'm like, what? There is clearly a difference here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I mean, even when you have other fitters out and they'll tell you, it's like, oh, you don't need to do that. And most people will believe them. It's like, oh, I guess I don't need it. It's like, if you're measured for any other equipment in any other sport, they will take everything into consideration. But for riding, suddenly it's not important.
Right.
It really makes no sense.
Right. And you just get an assembly line saddle and because a bunch of top level riders ride in it, must be the best option, right?
Basically, yep.
So what is the most important thing about saddle fitting?
Fit to the rider.
Okay.
I can have a saddle fitted perfectly to the horse. But if it doesn't fit the rider, they will cause it to no longer fit the horse.
Elaborate.
And a lot of people, when a lot of people ask, like, what's the most important? And I tell them it's the ride. Like, you see sort of like this confusion on their face. They're like, well, what do you mean? So, for example, let's take a saddle that's been fitted to a horse perfectly. In balance, wonderful. Throw on a rider. Rider is not fitted to that saddle. So rider, for example, if it's a male saddle and a female rider, in order to not crush her bits, unlike men, she can't put it left or right. We unfortunately sit right on the money.
Right.
She is going to either have to push back against the cantle or like tilt her pelvis backwards. What happens then is she can't absorb the motion of the horse anymore. And also if she's further back or if she's curling her back, she's coming down into the saddle like a jackhammer.
Right.
Her legs are also too far in front, so she's leaning forward. She is slamming against a cantle every time she posts, or even if she's sort of in a half seat, she's very unbalanced up there. And she relies on compensatory posture or even her hands to help balance herself. So how then is that horse supposed to move properly, supposed to be comfortable in that saddle when it's being pulled this way and that and slammed and bounced against and so on?
Right. And then, you end up with the horse that's traveling hollow or tight and tense, develops SI issues or kissing spine related problems, and then your saddle just doesn't fit anymore. That beautiful, perfect
Or the
saddle.
horse just refuses to go forward. And you have these riders, it's like, oh, my horse doesn't like turning left. It's like, that's a load of crap.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry, but that's a load of crap. Your horse doesn't like turning left. He won't turn left because of pain. Right. Not that he doesn't like that direction.
Right. There is almost always an issue, whether it's up in the neck or if it's the saddle's in the way or you're blocking somewhere. I mean, there's a whole slew of reasons, but I also don't accept that horses just don't turn. Or potentially, they've got a buddy on the fence line and they would like to go to the buddy. I mean, there are endless reasons, but I think it's important, and what you're saying about the difference between male versus female, and obviously that could be a whole series in and of itself and would need visual aids, but from my understanding in the Saddlefit for Life course that I'm taking, a female's pubic bone is a little bit lower than a male's, right? So we're almost always directly on it unless the saddle is fitted to women, because most saddles are manufactured and made by men and have historically been, and there hasn't really been any evidence or research, to my understanding, before you guys that said anything otherwise. And as a rider that has significant low back pain to the point of being nearly arthritic and this big old gigantic giraffe neck on my body, I suffer a lot of pain from riding incorrectly and watching myself in videos. I used to always be so ungodly frustrated that I couldn't sit up straight, or I always looked like I was tipping forward. And even when I would look down at my saddle, I would be like, my saddle looks like it's sitting off to the left. And I would tell my trainer, and she was like, well, you're probably pulling it one way. And I'm like, I'm looking at the saddle and it looked like the saddle looks straight, but I'm sitting off to the right. And so it's giving the illusion that it's off to the left. And, just a bunch of little things like that I just thought were par for the course, I guess. But not until I started taking the course did I realize that riding is not supposed to be painful. Like, you're not supposed to develop back issues from riding a horse. I was just like, well, it's unnatural.
No.
And it's tough. So, of course.
And what saddens me is you have all these young kids learning to ride horses, and from the get-go, they are having to compensate, or they're having to just sort of deal with it. Mm-hmm. And it becomes this thing where, as soon as they're in the saddle, they expect to have to protect themselves against something. So they immediately, without even realizing, slide back, tilt their pelvis back, or adjust themselves in a way to make them comfortable, but doesn't allow them to ride to their full potential.
Right.
And no one is doing anything about it.
Right.
It's and the worst part is the instructors are like, oh, pull your leg back, or,
right.
Whatever. Not realizing that physically, in order to follow the instructions of the coach or whatever, that person has to essentially hurt themselves.
Right. And
they have to put a lot of strain on their body and put themselves at risk of physical injury in order to comply.
Right. And I mean, growing up, I think I started riding when I was 7 and I'm 22 now. So and it just is chronic. If you're not riding in saddles that fit well and your horse isn't able to move without feeling like a washing machine, and you're not able to move with them without yourself feeling like a washing machine. And I just remember growing up and riding bareback and thinking I'd unlocked some new secret door, because I would round my low back, and so then I could absorb every movement in my low back. That ended up backfiring, because then what that does is it makes me lock in my neck so that I'm still up there, and then I'm working against my body the whole time. But I was trying to allow my seat to fit the horse's back and move with them while me also being stable, which just ends up being a bunch of static on the horse's back. And you also can't sit without rounding your back as a woman. It's not possible. because otherwise you're going to injure yourself in some very non-desirable areas. So on the flip side, what's the biggest consequence of a poorly fitted saddle? And obviously, poorly fitted to who? But I guess just in general, a poorly fitted saddle, like, what are some of the behavioral issues, the long-term career outlook of a horse that's, having to deal, or a horse and rider pair, I suppose, having to ride in a saddle that just doesn't fit?
So we'll look at it a little more on the horse side, but I want to sort of start off by saying there's so many different aspects that we look at in regards to how the saddle fits the horse, that every single aspect of fit has its own consequence if it's not suited to the animal.
Right.
So, for example, if you have a saddle where the tree width is too narrow, or the tree angle is, not suitable for the shoulders of the horse, then you risk damaging the scapula. You can cause atrophy to the trapezius. The horse will never lift the base of the neck. They'll be heavy in your hands. They'll be heavy on the forehand. That puts the tendons, ligaments, everything of the forelimbs at risk because they're taking all the concussion. The horse will also never round the back. So that means that the back remains dropped even during suspension, and that predisposes them to kissing spine. What else can happen is the spinal nerves come out on each side of the vertebrae. If there is too much instability in the back, or if the horse is not utilizing the back and the abdominal muscles correctly, that little hole where the nerves come out can get smaller. And I'm not sure if you've reached that part of our course yet, but we actually have photos of the vertebrae where that little hole has gotten smaller, and that means the nerves are pinched.
Ugh, yeah.
And there is no surgical procedure to fix that. That horse is not able to be ridden anymore.
That's crazy. I haven't reached that part of the course, but I feel like I've seen at least an infographic or maybe some photos of vertebrae that have encountered that issue. And that is absolutely terrifying. As somebody who experiences back pain, I can't imagine it being expected to carry a person on my back going through that. That's no bueno.
No, even just the saddle would cause a lot of pain.
Yeah, and regarding the gullet width, I was reading in the course about that, some people will say, well, it takes my horse about 20 minutes to warm up and then he's good after that. But if your channel is too narrow, and correct me if I'm messing anything up, I'm still very new, but that you're actually forcing the spine or the nerves running on either side of it to go numb, or the ligaments, I guess. Can you tell I'm like super well versed in anatomy? I'm getting there. That's why I'm.
So the gist of it is correct. When you have a horse where it takes it does take nerves about 20 minutes to sort of go numb with constant pressure. And the reason the gullet channel is so important is that the spine doesn't just move up and down, it moves laterally.
Right.
And not only that, but when the horse bends left or right, the saddle itself doesn't bend left or right, it remains straight. So the gullet needs to be wide enough so that when the horse bends, even the slightest amount, if it's too narrow, it'll actually contact the spine. And this is also important when you're looking at the asymmetry of a horse. So, for some reason, a lot of people think if you have an asymmetrical horse, you fit the saddle symmetrically. Like the saddle should be symmetric, but it shouldn't.
Right.
You should always fit an asymmetric horse with an asymmetrical saddle in order to keep it straight on the spine. Right. What happens if it isn't is the saddle will always fall into the hollow side, which means that the gullet is no longer parallel with the spine, which means panels are no longer parallel with the spine, which means that even going in a straight line, especially the back of the panel, will turn in and start bumping against the spine. And the spine itself, on the outside, it has the longissimus, which is meant to carry weight, but on the inside, it has a smaller muscle called multifidus, and that stabilizes the spine. You do not want to be sitting on that whatsoever. If you are next to your horse and you sort of run your fingers backwards along the spine, even just against the hair, like without much pressure, the horse will react. he won't pin his ears, he won't turn around and bite you. It's just a reaction. But suddenly with the narrow gullet channel, you've now told the body, don't lift. Drop away and lock to protect yourself.
Right.
And
Which is
you
bueno.
you predispose them to injuries and hollowness and heavy in the front and, just essentially shortening their career.
Yeah. And I have been guilty of that, and I am paying for it to this day with a mare that has just had kissing spine surgery. And looking at the saddles that I used to ride her in and their gullet channel, which I guess should probably define if people listening haven't already Googled it. That's the space on the underside of the saddle that either of the panels. Is that a good? I don't think I'm not painting a picture. You're better at this.
So it's basically the underside of the saddle, the space between the two panels. But one thing I will say is even with a sufficiently wide gullet channel,
mm-hmm.
if the saddle is placed on an asymmetric horse, which most of them are,
right,
it can still cross over and connect with the spine.
Right, which you explained to me a while back because I remember I asked you about it because I saw a post that was like, no, asymmetric is bad. And I was like, Sonja, counter. And but you were like, if the saddle is a perfectly symmetrical saddle sitting on an unsymmetrical surface, it's going to tip to the side because gravity. That's weaker, that's more hollow. So then you never have a shot at developing that weaker side because the horse is constantly being pinched, bumped, or aggravated in some way on that side. And then the side that's already stronger is now having to overcompensate for even more inhibition on that side. So,
yeah, and that's without a rider.
Right.
Imagine that. That's just a saddle that's been girthed up. And add a rider who now has to compensate for a saddle that is not balanced. So they're having to compensate for the saddle, and the horse has to compensate for saddle and rider. So tell me again, logically, how a horse is meant to become straighter with that.
We just don't deserve them.
I can't think of... Yeah, we really don't. We really don't.
Because I just know that there are so many people riding in the assembly line style saddles that are just mass produced, and they are inherently symmetrical, and most people adjust it that way or shim it so that they can hopefully get to a place where their horse is quote unquote symmetrical. But I don't know if there is such thing as any living breathing creature that is fully symmetrical. Don't think it exists.
And I mean, even we're not symmetrical.
Right.
We're stronger on one side. Horses are stronger. And even for horses, their organ placement isn't even symmetrical. Neither is ours.
Right. So how can
There's
you expect...
nothing that is symmetrical.
Right. So how can you expect...
why are we riding in a saddle that is symmetrical?
Right. And ideally, you have a saddle that has full contact with the horse's back, except for obviously along the spinal channel. But if it's a symmetrical saddle, then it's going to tip because you're fitting to an unrealistic standard, that not to the horse in front of you. And I understand that gets frustrating with horses like Zoe, who will be in a rehab program, that you're going to have to fit and refit and refit and refit and refit. And it gets pricey, but to some extent, I'm like, I don't know. I don't know how to solve the problem. But to me, it feels like if you're going to ride and put the horses in, different various situations for competition or recreation purposes, you should at least do them, the benefit of being comfortable and able to succeed. Because I feel like putting a saddle on, that doesn't fit the horse out of convenience or, an issue of affordability, which is the unfortunate commonality in all spheres of horses. But it's like asking a young horse to do, a full cross-country course when they have not seen a jump yet. It's not fair, and then you're setting the horse up for failure or to look like the bad horse that encounters behavioral issues like bucking or not moving forward or rearing, a slew of issues. So I guess, do you have thoughts on that? Or
So I think the biggest thing is, so I'll use like a dog or a cat as a pet for an example. When you get a dog, you expect to have to walk it correct?
Mm-hmm.
When you have a cat, you expect to have a litter box, which you have to scoop daily. When you have a horse, there is no expectation of saddle fitting. It is considered in excess of the care that you should provide to it when it shouldn't be. It is part of the core care that you should be providing your horse, just like with diet and farrier, turnout, whatever. It's just as important. And I think one of the reasons that people ignore it so much is, unlike cats and dogs, horses do not scream when they are in pain.
Right.
And a lot of their behavior is misunderstood for them misbehaving or, having an off day. We just don't understand their communication. We don't understand how they portray discomfort, how they, are trying to communicate with us. And because it's not as in your face as, like a scream or a biting or anything like that, it sort of gets pushed to the wayside and, dismissed.
Right.
And we have a lot of, riding schools or, the old, and I'm not, crapping on tabloids or anything, but a lot of like the old school types where it's like, oh, I use this saddle on all of my horses. The saddle doesn't need to fit. It's like, if you have a kid, would you give them one pair of shoes and expect them to wear it for the rest of their life?
Right.
Horses grow, horses develop, their body changes incredibly fast, and it will change through their entire life. Why are we ignoring that fact for convenience?
Right. And I mean, I guess the biggest difference is that needing to go clean your litter box is free and needing to have a saddle that fits your horse isn't. But I mean, like, to me, in order to be ethical and humane to the horse that we use to fulfill our recreational or competitive nature, is like, if we're going to do that, then we need to set the horse up for success and take them into consideration rather than just, I hate to say it because, I mean, it's such a conundrum, really, because, I know that the people that listen to this podcast care more about their horses than just about anything else. And to say, well, you might be doing your horse a disservice if you haven't bought a fully custom saddle, but at the same time, a lot of people can't afford it. And it's, to me, come to the point where, like, I'm not riding my horse or several of the other horses because we don't have a saddle that fits them. And I feel that it's unethical to ask them to, do this thing that I need them to do because I need the commission or because I want to ride my horse. But if I don't have a saddle that fits them and it's going to cause them pain, then it doesn't seem like that. It seems like my reasoning would be selfish then, and then I'm doing it at the expense of the horse, which is not something that's cool.
I mean, when you're purchasing a horse, the cost of a saddle and continuous saddle fitting should be taken into consideration in the same way that a cost of, a vet check and continual vet checks are considered.
Right.
That will help to set people up with, preparing for the expense of actually taking care of all of the horse's needs. But I wanted to comment very briefly on, because you mentioned a custom saddle. Mm-hmm. And a lot of people have this misconception that custom saddles are the be-all, end-all, not realizing that a custom saddle, for the most part, cannot be adjusted. Right. So once you have it, you have it. But if your horse changes, bye-bye saddle.
Right, and that's the issue that I ran into my whole riding career. I was like, well, this saddle's custom. It was a $5,000 saddle, and it doesn't fit my horse. Now what? I can't just sell this saddle. Like, when I was younger and my parents bought it for me, I'm like, I can't be like, hey, Mom and Dad, I know that you're a teacher and a police officer, but I need a different $5,000 saddle. And so then you just end up getting stuck with it or buying into memory foam pads or the air pads with the rubber that's squishy and whatnot. And I've heard a lot of different things about half pads. Generally, it's not something I tend to go for just because I don't have enough information on it to make an educated decision. And a lot of it, I feel like, changes the saddle fit in probably a negative way. Mostly because I don't know what I'm doing. I'm getting there, thank God for the course. But, yeah.
I mean, for saddle pads, the the purpose, especially in English saddles, the purpose of the pad is to protect your saddle against sweat.
Mm-hmm.
Like, that's all it's supposed to do.
Right.
In the cases of, pads with pockets, you can, if you know how, and I guarantee you most people don't,
mm-hmm.
you can do shimming to temporarily help with a saddle that, mostly fits but can't be adjusted asymmetrically.
Mm-hmm.
And sort of going back to your point of, buying like a $5,000 custom saddle, for us, it's not about the cost of the saddle. Like, it doesn't matter what brand, how old it is, nothing. The ideal saddle for a horse is one that can be adjusted because, again, the back changes constantly, and hopefully for the better if you're training the horse in a manner that is suited to their physique and their well-being.
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of people get stuck on I can't afford a huge, $5,000 expensive custom saddle. It's like, well, you don't need to.
Okay.
All you need is to know what your horse needs, first and foremost. Don't go out there looking for this saddle, that saddle, with this component, that component. Leave that till later. Figure out what your horse needs first. Figure out what you need. And then go out and see what saddle can kind of, provide comfort and support for your horse. If it needs a little bit of shimming, that's fine. You don't have to spend thousands and thousands. We've seen people, find a perfectly suitable saddle for like $400.
Right. Yeah, and I guess my thought would be, you've mentioned adjustable saddles, and I feel like that is another word like custom that probably means a bunch of different things to people or different people that, before I started taking the course, in my mind, an adjustable saddle was one like the Wintec or the Bates that have the changeable gullet system. But I'm assuming that you're talking about a little bit more than just the gullet. So do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah. So there are three main types of saddles. There's one that's not adjustable. So they're usually built on like a wood tree
mm-hmm.
or like a hard plastic tree. The next one is the interchangeable saddle. So you can change out the gullet plate, or you have sort of like the Genesis tree where you can use an Allen key to make adjustments. But that really only changes the front. The last one is an adjustable, where you actually need a tree machine, like a hydraulic tree machine or whatever. And a fitter comes out and they take the measurements of the horse, and it can be adjusted in width, in angle, and also asymmetrically without twisting the tree. And that's the kicker. A lot of saddles, if you were to do an asymmetrical adjustment on them when they're not meant to have it, you will twist the entire tree or break it. So a truly adjustable saddle is one that can be adjusted in, number one, width, number two, angle, number three, asymmetrically without twisting the whole tree. And they're usually built on trees that are made out of polyurethane.
Right.
Anything wood. So if you have a saddle with a wood tree and a fitter comes out and says, I can adjust that, run away, because they are going to break your tree. If you have a hard plastic tree and they say, I can adjust that, run away. We've had high level riders riding in saddles that when you look at it with the naked eye, you're like, oh, it's fine. When our saddle fitter took it apart and opened it up, the tree was broken.
Oh, no.
In 3 places. Because someone had gone in, tried to adjust it, and broke it.
That's crazy. Is there any way to tell without taking it apart?
That it's broken, or what kind of tree it has?
That it's broken.
Sometimes it's really difficult. It might just be a fracture.
Mm-hmm.
But if you hold the saddle sideways, sort of against your rib cage, and you pull inward, so you're essentially trying to pull the two flaps together.
Right.
Watch the pommel. Make sure you're not seeing any rippling, especially underneath. You don't want to see any rippling. A lot of people have this misconception where if you pull the flap inward, sort of tuck it underneath the saddle, they'll see a fold and they'll freak out. If it's really high up, sort of underneath or above the D-ring, that's broken.
Okay.
underneath the D-ring, that just is usually a very short tree point.
Interesting. Huh. There's so much to know. So
there really is. And people are like, you know, what's the one thing that needs to fit? And it's like, well, there's not really one.
No, it depends. That's the response that I have gotten from any professional I've ever spoken to about, you know, a niche area of horse care or management or training. It's always met with, well, it depends. And
everything is connected too. So you can't just fix one or have one area that's perfect and have the rest that, you know, are horrible. Because it's not going to be of any benefit.
And I guess that's why horses are so addicting, because there's never a cap. You just can keep learning forever.
Which is somewhat a bit of a curse, because the more you learn, the less you realize you actually know.
Oh, for sure. It is imposter syndrome all the way. And it's just crazy because, you know, I thought I could look at a saddle and be like, yeah, that fits probably. And now going through the equine ergonomist course, it's like, okay, now I'm to the point where I'm like even scared to give an opinion about a saddle because there's so much to consider. And, you know, I am going through and re-going through the course so that I will feel confident eventually. But there's just so much to know. And I don't want to say that to discourage people from learning, but it's, if you think, and if you've never taken any sort of studying on anatomy or saddle fitting or anything like that, and you think that you know how to fit a saddle, you probably don't. There's way too much to know. And I think that that's a very common misconception, because when I've talked to people about it, they're like, oh yeah, I know how to I know how to fit a saddle, but like, you know, should I look into the equine ergonomist course? And I'm like, yes. If you think you know, and you're doing it, you probably should.
We've had other practicing saddle fitters take our course just to, you know, continue professional development. You know, they want to get as much information as possible. And this is back when we've also done in-person courses, and they've come up to us and said, this has answered all of the questions that I had at the end of my other course. And this is not to sort of, you know, say that the other courses are terrible. It's just that we go so in depth into anatomy, biomechanics, both static and dynamically, and human anatomy, that we try and leave sort of no stone unturned.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think that's what I really respect about you guys, and why I'm like so all about having you on the podcast and taking the course. And, you know, it's just, there's just so much to know, and you guys put it all together so nicely. And like, I read your Facebook posts on the Saddlefit for Life page and on the Instagram, and I'm just constantly sharing them to my story, because I'm like, people need to know. Like, this is such valuable information. And I think people just go, oh yeah, my saddle fits, I don't need to know about it. And I mean, I can't really blame everyone that much, because there are so many things to focus on with horses. But I think that a lot of the issues that people tend to run into with, you know, maybe having a high-low foot, or not being able to get the rounded back that they want in training, or their horse is not really excelling in lateral movement. A lot of those training and basic care issues could be fixed by having a saddle. Not that you can just automatically correct a high-low foot with a saddle that fits, but, you know, if your saddle is falling to the hollow side, I would imagine that would create a distortion in the hoof development, because their muscles change.
There's a lot that the saddle can affect, and one thing that people really don't think about is spookiness. Mm-hmm. Like a horse being spooky. That can be attributed to physical discomfort. And we've had another guest who did work with us. Her name is Barbara Schulte. She's from Germany, and she talks a lot about breeding standards and how we are breeding modern horses to basically be handicapped. They don't move naturally. They don't have the same, you know, physical ratios that a normal standard horse should. And it makes them spookier because they're always in a state of discomfort. And when you look at saddle fit, a saddle that doesn't fit correctly will cause a horse, or can cause a horse, to remain in a state of elevated stress.
Mm-hmm.
So they're always in fight or flight mode. And another thing that it does, besides, creating a horse that is overly spooky, is they can't absorb anything that you're teaching them. They can't focus. So suddenly you have a horse that is, and I quote, unwilling to learn, unwilling to work, hates work, et cetera, insert whatever excuse you want.
Right. And that's what I talk about a lot on this podcast too. Like anytime I'm presented with a situation where a horse is experiencing some behavioral issues or just isn't really progressing, the first thing I ask is, have you checked for ulcers? Have you checked for back pain? Have you had anybody out to look at this horse? Because you cannot train through pain. I would be wasting my breath to even venture into a discussion on how you might fix this if the horse is experiencing pain in one way or another. And if the saddle doesn't fit, or if, their feet are uncomfortable, your horse is just going to be, that much further up the scale of unsuccessful. And I've noticed with a lot of our horses that we get right off the track and they've been fed rocket fuel. And their tummies don't feel good, and they've had this big change in environment, and they end up with ulcers. When they come home, they are just neurotic and crazy. And then when we change their diet, get their feet on the right track, and give them a letdown period where they're out in a herd with other horses having their basic needs met, then all of a sudden they are the most deadhead, quiet, happy, in your pocket, cool to do whatever dudes, and they don't care about, flapping things in the wind or the new arena or anything like that. They're very calm and relaxed, and it's not the horse that we knew at the beginning. And it goes to show that it's just not something that is really trainable. It's a management and equipment change that makes all the difference.
And it saddens me because they're so willing.
Mm-hmm.
They really are. They're the most willing partner, and the things that we put them through, it saddens me. It breaks my heart.
Yep. I'm right there with you. They're just so willing to please and to go and do and whatever. I mean, the stuff like looking at Rolex and having the horses run on these gigantic courses for 15 minutes, jumping these massive fences that would terrify just about any other horse. And they're so willing, and they've gotten to this point, training and learning and going and doing. And there are probably a lot of them that are suffering in one way or another from some sort of issue. And I know a lot of the top-level horses are best taken care of, but there are top-level riders that might not know a lot about Saddlefit or don't have a great fitter and, end up with a horse that is suffering but still willing to do the job. And it's just... it says a lot about horses and a lot about people, I think.
And another thing is that the professional career of high-level horses has shortened quite substantially over time as well. And unfortunately, especially with a lot of high-level riders, is they really don't know anything about Saddlefit. Not that I'm saying that they should, but it is my belief that every single person who rides a horse should at least know the very basics. But they're always sponsored by companies, and these companies, for the most part, don't care about Saddlefit. And I know I'm going to get hate for this, but they really don't. If you come out with a saddle and you say, this fits every horse, you're lying.
Right. And I've seen so many saddles advertised that way, or trainers, particularly Instagram trainers, that say, well, I got this saddle from X brand and it's designed to fit every horse. All I have to do is take it in the tack room, adjust a couple things, and then I'm good to go and it fits every horse. And it's just like, there's just no way that that's true. You might think it is, and you might be being honest, and that's what you genuinely believe, but that doesn't make it, unequivocally true. It's what you've been told, and it's marketing, because who wouldn't want to buy the saddle that fits every horse? I mean, every trainer, professional rider, owner that has multiple horses would be like, this is a perfect solution to all of my woes. But that's an unfortunate, that's not possible. There's no way.
And it goes back to providing adequate care for the horse. If you are looking for something simply out of convenience, then you really are not taking into consideration the well-being of the animal.
Right. Which is, like, there's just so many things to consider. So part of me doesn't fault riders, but I would like to use this episode and our conversation to raise more awareness about it, that it is something that if you haven't been considering it, is something that you really need to take into consideration, because it will affect your horse down the line. Take it from somebody whose mare has kissing spine and probably a host of SI issues, and she has fusing hocks now, and has historically been she was known infamously for her tail swishing, and she was the crazy hot mare that everyone got a kick out of watching, and I got an ego boost because I could handle this mare. But have we met horses? They just want to chill outside in a field with their homies. Like, it's not that deep. So if the horse is acting this way and it's directly, contradicting to their nature, then something's probably going wrong, and it's probably not the horse's fault or a character flaw. And that's something that I definitely had to come to terms with my mare, and it's something that, eats me alive. I know that, you can only do as best you can with what you know when you know it, and when you know better, you can do better. But I mean, it still sucks that I've got this mare that is phenomenally talented, and she has a whole host of, physiological issues because she was mistreated. I mean, she was trained through pain and ridden in equipment that was like riding or running miles in a shoe way too small. And it's just like, oh God. And I hate that for other people. And so that's why I want to have this podcast where, we can make that information a little bit more accessible and allow people to not do the same thing that I did. Basically, just do as I say, not as I did. And
I really want, I don't want your listeners to hear everything and be like, oh my God, there's nothing I can do. I want to invite everyone who listens to this to, reach out to us on Facebook, reach out to us on Instagram. We're always there to answer questions. If you want to submit photos, let us know. We're there to help you. We're there to educate you. We're there to guide you. We're not going to be like, put in your credit card number for 5 minutes. That's not how it works. Mm-hmm. We've had so many people come to us. It's like, hey, can you help with our saddle fits? Like, yes. And then we'll tell you exactly, what few photos that we need to really get a better understanding of what we're working with. And we'll give you as much help and guidance as possible. And if you're in an area of one of our fitters, we'll connect you with them as well. And they'll work with you to get you into something that is more suitable for you and your horse, or even find a temporary solution for your existing saddle if it's possible. We're always willing to work with you, because in the end, we don't get commission. We don't even sell saddles. We don't sell any tack. It's just pure education. Mm-hmm. All we want is to see a horse that is not suffering. And if we help 1, 2, 5 people with their horses and they're able to, ride pain-free, that's a win for us. Even if, it took 20 hours of us helping you and we got nothing in return, that horse being in comfort is what we want. That's our return.
Right. That's why I want to work with you guys. And it's just everything that I believe in. And it's awesome. I mean, so many companies and saddle brands are just about how many saddles can we sell, not is it actually making a positive impact on the horses and the riders, or are we just overcharging for essentially a piece of wood that hurts? Ugh.
Yeah. And for us, I mean, I've been very, very particular about, our students shouldn't be recommending singular brands. If you are certified, you should remain unbiased. We have a whole code of ethics, of very strict rules and regulations for anyone who takes the course, and you would know, because that's the first lesson that is there. You have to agree to it to even access anything else.
Right.
We're there to help. We're not there to sell. We're not there to judge. We're not there to make anyone feel stupid or terrible. We're there to help. Ask us. Ask us everything. Even if you think it's stupid, just ask.
Right.
We've heard it all. We'll give you as much information as you're willing to, hear. Just reach out. Reach out, because I guarantee you, if you don't, your horse is going to suffer. You're going to end up paying the price, either monetarily or by, losing your best friend.
Right.
Just don't be shy.
Well, I think that's awesome, and that will go a long way with those listening, because I feel like up until this point we've been kind of like, this is why saddle fitting is frustrating, and these are why everything that you've ever believed is wrong. So I feel like it's a nice little break to be like, also we can help. But yeah, so I think we've made it through 3 of our questions so far. So if you're still good to kick on, I think we can try and bust through these, like 2/3 that we have left.
Yes. yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So number 4 here, we have the most important element, the length, the width, panel depth. Is there one, or is it just needs to fit?
So there is no one single element, but I'm going to say 3, but I'll probably make it to 5. I'm going to give 3 things that every single person can do to check.
Okay.
So the first one is length, because if a saddle is too long, what happens is the loins actually push it onto the shoulder, and then the shoulder kicks it back. So you have this sort of back and forth motion. And also, sitting on the lumbar is going to either have your horse buck you off or constantly sort of bunny hop in the back to try and push you off the lumbar. So in order to check length, first and foremost, your saddle should be positioned correctly, so just behind the shoulder blade. What we usually do is sit the saddle on top of the shoulder and slide it back until it sort of just rests. It like nestles into its spot.
I did learn that trick a long time ago. That is one thing that carried over.
So once the saddle is there, go to the hip, find the point of the hip and sort of palpate gently forward. Make sure you don't get kicked. And you will find the 18th rib. Be very careful, because there are a lot of fitters who say go straight up. And if you do, you're going to end up in the lumbar, probably like L3, L4, depending on the horse. So find the rib, and then carefully, again, make sure your horse doesn't cow kick you, carefully follow the curvature up towards the spine.
Right.
And you'll lose it sort of about 8-10 inches down because of the longismus that runs over it, but just sort of eyeball the curve. When you hit the spine, that's when you go straight down, and that is the last point where you want to put pressure. So that gives you length.
Right. And that's
is
different in Western saddles, right? Just a little bit. Like there's no...
Yeah, so for Westerns, if they have a skirt, a lot of them do extend quite far back. But what you can do is you can take a pen and sort of run it underneath and make sure the pen moves freely so that there's no pressure there.
In the lumbar region.
So what happens in the lumbar region, yeah.
Okay, sweet.
So like any ballpoint pen, you can like sort of slide it underneath the rear flare, and you should be able to move it freely without it getting stuck anywhere.
Right. And so bouncing off of that and into the panel depth and the width of the gullet, I've learned in the course that, especially on our sporty horses with the short backs, if you're a heavier rider or a tall rider like me, then you end up needing a saddle that extends further into your horse's lumbar spine. But from my understanding, you can make adaptations to the panel to distribute the weight more evenly over the horse instead of having this teeny tiny little saddle that, it's the classic physics lesson where if you press down on a balloon on a bed of one nail, the balloon will pop. But if you press down on a balloon on a panel of a million nails, then the balloon won't pop because the weight gets evenly distributed. And so with the panel depth and width, I just want to kind of cover that a little bit because I know there are riders of different shapes and sizes. And if you're looking at yourself in the mirror and you're like, okay, I'm 5'10", and my horse is, 15 hands or so, I'm going to need a saddle that's bigger than the horse. So how does that affect the panel depth and width?
So there are saddles where the panel is smaller than the seat. So the seat length is determined by several different factors. First is how long the pommel is, the placement of the nail, which can be placed pretty much anywhere by the saddle maker, and how much foam is in the back, pretty much against the cantle, so rear support for the rider. I have a massive horse who has a 15-inch saddle support area. My saddle for the seat is 18 inches. So it is doable. It's absolutely doable. But you absolutely do not want a saddle that extends into the lumbar, because you will run into some severe problems.
Right. So you just, if you are in that situation, really need to be sure that you're working with a saddle that can accommodate a seat size that's bigger, but still stay within the saddle support area and distribute your weight appropriately and fairly to the horse.
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
There's also different options in regards to, I know a lot of dressage panels have like this huge, it juts out pretty far in the back with the belief that, it provides extra comfort for the horse when it really doesn't. If you have a horse with a very small saddle support area, some of the things that the rider can do is have a flatter seat, so it gives them a little bit more room to move around. Have a saddle with a slightly lower cantle, so not holding you in place like a lot of modern dressage saddles.
Right.
So going with an all-purpose or even a jumper would help if you're really struggling to find a saddle that fits you and also fits the horse. And when looking at panels, if you look at most jumping saddles, they have very upswept panels.
Right.
And we call them like a banana panel.
Okay.
So that, even though the panel end extends further than the end of the saddle support area, the pressure is not all the way to where the panel itself ends, because it sweeps up so steeply.
Right.
So there are different things you can look at in a saddle that can help accommodate sort of, what the rider needs and what the horse also needs.
Awesome. Yeah. Thank God for science. So, I guess we can move into the pros and cons of the different types of panels on that note. The wool versus foam versus air. What are your thoughts regarding that?
So air, we've done a lot of testing on air, and air is quite finicky. Right. So first and foremost, it expands and contracts, obviously, with different temperatures. So if you are in an area where there are a lot of temperature variances, air would not be sort of the best one for you. And there was, I can't recall the name of the study, but they found that the instance of pain in the rider, in the rider was actually higher for air panels because it didn't absorb the shock as well as wool or anything else.
Right.
Air, it can become quite hard. So I wouldn't recommend air. In regards to foam, the only thing about foam I'll say is you can't adjust it.
Right.
So once it's compressed, it's compressed. And there are so many different types of foam. It depends on the sensitivity of the horse as well. Foam tends to hold a lot of heat. And if your horse is, I know a lot of horses with the varying skin conditions where you want to have some sort of airflow. You want to, not have an area where there's basically no airflow and there's a lot of heat sort of trapped. And foam also, again, depending on the type of foam that's used, it can be also quite hard and not really distribute the weight of the rider properly or, distribute concussion.
Right. I've ridden in several that end up feeling like bricks on the bottom. And
go ahead.
I was just saying that, I've ridden in several that have ended up feeling like bricks, just even to the touch. And I can't imagine that does a lot. And I mean, of course, it would depend, I imagine, on the type of foam, but that it just ends up with you sitting on bricks on the horse's back, and there's no airflow, it's hot, and it's rigid. And pony backs are not rigid.
No, I would recommend either wool or like a wool synthetic mix, because it can be And I just want to preface this by saying saddle fit cannot be adjusted by reflocking. You can reflock all you want, but the tree points, especially on wool or wool synthetic or whatever, the structure of the tree will always determine the fit. The flocking is just sort of, to make us feel better as riders, like, oh, I flocked it, so therefore it fits. And if the saddle angle and width don't fit, then it doesn't fit. I'm sorry. It's just how it is.
That's actually something I was not aware of. I mean, it seems like, I've always heard that wool is the best option and that you can change the fit. And to me, it seems like you can obviously flock more on one side and maybe accommodate asymmetry a little bit in that regard. But if the tree itself is still off, then you're just kind of being counterintuitive, I guess.
The only thing that flocking can really help with is, helping to lift the saddle a little bit to sort of help balance it out a little bit, or, provide the horse with a bit more comfort. But for example, I'd say majority, if not almost all English saddles, the tree points will fall through. You, with your hand, if you press against the underside of the panel, you can feel the tree points. Mm-hmm. So no matter how the panel is flocked, as soon as it is girthed up on the horse and that rider is added, those tree points come straight through. So if they don't fit, they don't fit.
That is a very good point.
There's nothing you can do about it.
Right. So moving into the trees question here. So, Sonja, do you prefer adjustable or fixed trees on a saddle?
Always adjustable. Here's the thing though. I'm not going to say don't ever buy a saddle that isn't adjustable. Okay. Just be prepared to change your saddle when your horse changes.
Yeah.
A fixed tree can fit a horse. Don't get me wrong. It can absolutely fit a horse, but it will not always fit the horse. Just like with an adjustable tree, you can have it adjusted, but if the horse changes and you don't adjust that tree, it no longer fits.
It seems like there needs to be some sort of subscription box service that you can just do like a trade post on saddles. So if you can't get an adjustable tree, then just everybody that's dealing with this fictional subscription box would just be like, okay, well, my horse doesn't need this particular tree shape anymore. Anybody else need it? Cool. You have one I can have? Okay, we'll swap. And unfortunately, I don't believe that there is a service like that.
The only problem is even measuring the saddle or measuring what the horse needs, there is no standard language. Mm-hmm. Like if I were to take, saddle A that is a medium, whatever hell that means, right, and measure it point to point on the end of the tree, and take another saddle from a different manufacturer, also medium, and do the same measurement, it would be completely different.
Right. And
there is no standard.
Yeah, to me it seems like women's pants. There's just, you never know what the number really means, or what the medium narrow, wide, medium wide, what any of it means. It's all dependent on who measured it and what brand, which is frustrating.
Pretty much, yeah. And that's why when we fit saddles, we never ever say medium, medium wide, narrow, because really, what does it mean?
Nobody knows.
If I tell you I need a medium, what is in your head? You're like, okay, what is it? Angle? Is it width? Is it like what is it?
Yeah, to me it's
the manufacturers can't agree.
I go by like horse style. Like I imagine medium narrow to narrow is generally a thoroughbred, and then warm bloods and round quarter horses end up as wides, and then the appendix breeds that's how I've always kind of categorized it. But then what about the round thoroughbred or the, shark fin quarter horse? And then it just, none of it matters. It's just, it all depends on who's measuring.
I'll use my horse as an example. She is, like I said, a nightmare to fit. I'm pretty sure if we tested all of our fitters on her, they would fail. That is how much of a nightmare she is. But she is thoroughbred through and through. When you look at her shoulders width-wise, they're very wide.
Right.
When you look at her shoulder angle-wise, she's very steep.
Yeah.
So looking at her, I'm like, okay, do I need narrow? Do I need a wide?
Yeah.
Like,
I had my
I don't
horse
know.
before.
There's nothing that fits her.
Right. My horse before Zoe was, he was named Bo, and he had a big old shark fin wither with not a top line in sight. And we can all make our own assumptions about as to why that was. But when I had the fitter out to make a custom saddle to him, it ended up with a very narrow gullet and angle, and then the the knee roll panels just flared to, I guess, to accommodate his shoulder, but there was no rounding, no nothing, so it just ended up sticking out off of him instead of like wrapping and hugging his body with his shape. And it was just like, I guess the attempt was to just have full clearance, but really it just made everything else have to compensate more and creating more pressure points, thus not allowing him to develop a top line or anything like that. And so I feel you in that regard. I have been there, don't appreciate it. I like that Zoe's a little bit more stereotypical, but I haven't had to fit her yet. So we'll see with my new knowledge what I think, or if she is a nightmare.
And I'll give your viewers, or sorry, your listeners, a little bit of advice on how to measure if their saddle tree is wide enough in the width, not the angle.
Oh, awesome. Yeah.
And that is having the saddle on the horse placed correctly, not girthed, but just placing, if you're right-handed, placing your left hand on the pommel and pressing down. Actually, you know what? For this exercise, you probably don't even need to press down. But you know how in Pony Club they always teach you how to check underneath the pommel, how many fingers there is gap-wise. When you're checking the width, you want to check between the edge of the saddle, underneath, basically pretty much underneath the pommel, and against the edge of the spine. So your hand is going to be parallel to the ground as you slide it in against the top edge of the spine. I'm not sure if I'm explaining that.
Nope, I've got my hand.
Is understandable.
I've got my hand hovering on my imaginary horse. I'm following.
Okay, so if you have less than 2 to 3 fingers, it's too narrow. And I say that because as the horse moves, again, the spine moves laterally.
Right.
So if you turn or if your horse bends, that saddle's going to come in and bump the spine. That's the last thing you want to do. And you want to measure that on both sides.
Okay. So ideally you would have how many fingers? Assuming you have a standard
So
hand.
ideally between 2 and 3 on both sides.
Okay. So, I think I get it. So your hand is on the side of the spine laying, and you shouldn't hit, say, the start of the panel.
It's sort of between the and I mean, you have a giant withered horse. It's between the top edge of the wither. So you're not on the wither, but you're sort of next to it.
Okay.
And then measuring the gap between the wither and, wherever the saddle starts.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense to me. I hope it makes sense to everyone else. I at least have a mental picture in my head. I hope it's right. This is where demos come in handy.
Yes, yeah, for sure.
Need visual aids. Okay, so as far as we answered how far back the saddle should go, so including shoulder asymmetry and saddle fitting, I think we covered that one a little bit, but is there anything else you want to say on that?
I'll say for shimming, a lot of people make the mistake of shimming into the gap. So let's say we have a horse that has the right shoulder a bit more forward and the saddle is moving to the right. They'll fill the right side, which is the gap, but really they should be filling. So this is a saddle that's going to the right. They should fill left front, right rear.
Okay. Interesting.
And a lot of people, I'll tell them that, they'll be like, what?
The right side's not the problem.
It's backwards to them.
Right. That makes sense. So, so I guess on that, since I know we wanted to talk about saddle pads and half pads more, is there any like gimmicky type saddle pad that you think that there's a lot of misconception about? Because I know like the memory foam pads have historically not been my favorite, or the gel pads, because I feel like they just create a lot of movement, or in the case of memory foam, potentially compaction, similar to what we were talking about with the foam panels. So is there any, like, is fleece better? Do you have a thought on that, or is it just your saddle needs to fit?
Honestly, your saddle needs to fit. In regards to the saddle pad, it's less about the material, more about the care.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people use harsh detergents. You shouldn't. You should use something very gentle. Wash it regularly. Make sure there's no, like knots or anything underneath the saddle pad. A lot of horses have skin sensitivity, which will come up if the saddle pad's not cleaned or cared for properly.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not a big fan of half pads because it's similar to, let's say you have a shoe that fits and you decide to add a couple more socks. Why? What for?
Right.
What is the purpose of it other than making it tighter?
Right. And that's something that I've always wondered. And I can actually cut this part out of the episode, this what I'm about to say, if you don't want to talk about brands. But, for kissing spine, I've done a lot of looking into the thin line pads because they talk so much about their research into it and what the surgeons have to say. And it seems like thin line is supposed to be a weight distribution kind of thing. I don't know. Clearly, I haven't retained anything that I read. Thanks, brain. But do you have thoughts on that? Or is it just like if the saddle fits, you don't really need any extra concussion support?
So I'll explain it in this way. If you have a pad, and most saddle pads are soft.
Mm-hmm.
So let's say you have a saddle pad like a thin line or anything that, doesn't have sort of like a rigid surface. If you were to walk around on that saddle pad in high heels, it would not distribute your weight. It would be localized wherever that heel went.
Right.
So if you take that pad, a soft pad, any pad, and throw a traditional saddle on top, it cannot physically distribute the tree point or the pressure from the tree point. It can't. Right. It simply can't do it. The only time that it can is if it's made or backed with a rigid material like plastic or whatever, something where the pressure cannot, poke through in one central location.
Right. Interesting. That is something that I'm going to have to think about because, it just seems like, it would add an extra layer of comfort. But is that more just make the rider feel better kind of thing?
It basically does help make the rider feel better. It might add like a little bit of cushioning. Mm-hmm. But when you're talking about the weight of the rider and how the weight of the rider is carried by the tree of the saddle, the only way that is going to get distributed distributed over a large area is if it's landing on something that doesn't cave and give where the pressure points are.
Okay. Interesting. So is there ever a circumstance where you would want to use a half pad, or mostly just in shimming circumstances?
Honestly, I would recommend maybe, if you need to do shimming. The only problem is with shimming, a lot of people don't realize that when you shim, you have to be very careful that the shim itself doesn't move. And saddle pads do tend to move. Mm-hmm. That means that wherever you wanted to shim, you're not necessarily shimming. Right. So you might be creating pressure points somewhere without realizing it, thinking that, you shimmed correctly, but saddle pad moved, things got shuffled around. The best way to actually shim is to shim the saddle itself, which I don't know that it even exists at this point.
Yeah, that makes sense. I know so many people that it doesn't really matter what horse it goes on. They throw a fleece pad on, and I've done it before, or used a thin line, or I don't know, just any pad under the assumption that it will help make the horse more comfortable. But from what I'm gathering, it's just really not going to make a significant difference.
if you have a horse that is very sensitive in the back, and you want to just provide a little bit more cushioning, but again, you have to be careful that you're not essentially making the saddle fit tighter with this addition.
Right. Yeah, because, I mean, obviously Zoe just had kissing spine surgery. The comfort and sensitivity of her back is at the forefront of my considerations in, moving forward, getting a new saddle for her. And so it's like, do I want to be able to put a pad on, or is it just better to just make sure that the saddle fits very well over time? That was a question.
Yeah, it's definitely better to make sure that the saddle fits.
Okay.
A lot of people, if they come to us and say, my horse is overly sensitive or whatever, we'll ask them, have you, considered that there might be other things going on, perhaps it's weakness related, and, try and sort of guide them that way, as opposed to just throwing on, pad after pad after pad.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. And so I would imagine that with like really thick, I'm not sure if you're familiar with poly pads, like those type of saddle pads that are really thick and poofy, those would create a similar issue as opposed to just like a regular cloth saddle pad.
Yeah. Honestly, the best pad you can use is one that is, just there to protect the saddle, has wither relief. So it is in the shape of the back. You do not want a square pad. No horse is square.
I know.
So you want something that has the shape of the back.
I can't stand those like baby pad types that just like that. You're either going to end up with a crease and a fold and therefore a pressure point, or the pad pushing straight down onto the wither. And like there's just no comfortable way to do that. I don't know why people make those.
I mean, we're female, we wear bras. If something were to, even if like a small weight was to just sort of pull on one of the straps all day,
mm-hmm.
it would irritate the crap out of us. And
right.
It would hurt. You'd have like a little sore. So imagine the weight of a rider causing that to go back and forth over the withers, rubbing constantly.
Yeah, to the demise or disappointment of my past and current partner is like I am all about a sports bra. I refuse to wear wire bras unless it's a very special occasion because the straps are too thin. My saddle support is not great. I need a thick strap, and because it's way more comfortable. So to further your metaphor there, I mean, wider to a certain extent, better, and no pressure points, please. I genuinely cannot stand regular bras, and I just end up wearing sports bras all the time because they're comfy, and I much prefer them. So subject my horse to that as well.
And I'll go on and say, like, especially over the spine, a lot of horses, they'll drop away from pressure, not consciously.
Right.
But it's just a reaction. So a pad that places pressure, especially because they usually have some sort of stitching and, whatever decorative thing that they have on the back, if it is sort of curled downward and digs into the spine, you're essentially telling the horse, hey, don't lift.
Right. And they can't do anything about it. It's a reflex.
Yeah, they're not trying to drop away. They're just you're telling the body, hey, drop away. And I mean, and I'm sidetracking a little bit here, but there's a lunging device with a rope that goes between the front legs and over the spine. And I quote, it is supposed to help supple the horse, whatever, all this gimmicky, marketing BS. It's like you have directly told the horse, don't lift the back.
And it's so counterintuitive because you've got this piece of rope pressing on their back, which tells the horse invert and lift your head. So then when they drop their head, I guess I understand the logic of it because then when they lift their head, the rope tells them to put their head down. But if they take a step and, maybe the rope's too tight and it grabs the spine again, then you're just basically telling the horse to cat-cow. Like, this isn't yoga. Don't do that.
Yeah. And it's just a false frame. It's a false frame. That's all you're making.
And
You're not teaching the horse collection. You're not
No.
teaching the horse to engage. You're not teaching the horse to lift the base of the neck. Nothing. You're just head down, heavy, drop the back,
Right. And
ball
then
strain. That's all it is.
you end up with a bunch of different, and I'm in a bunch of kissing spine support groups, and I see people posting about that, and I'm like, please don't use that on your horse. That will literally undo your rehab. Don't. So.
We did a presentation with a vet who is right now based out of South Africa, and she's been doing dissections for a very long time. She works with the Helen Alana Davies Research Project.
Yeah.
And she did a small segment on that particular rope and how it creates, instability, it creates pressure, and people are like, oh, it's a soft rope. And it's like, that doesn't matter. It's still pressure and friction.
Right. And a lot of people say things like about that, well, I let it out. It's loose. It's not even tight. And I'm like, then why use it at all? If it's not even functioning, you're just irritating the horse or, creating a potentially dangerous situation for no reason because it's so loose. It's not even doing what it is intended to do. And then when it is tight enough, then it's still causing problems. This is why we say train and don't use gadgets.
People are always rushing in their training, but they're rushing to the wrong destination, and they are putting themselves further back than where they started.
Right. One of my favorite training, I don't know if proverb is a strong word, but slow down, you'll go faster, is so true.
Yeah.
In every facet of horses. So I guess, do you have any thoughts on synthetic saddles? Like, do they pose any differences as
in
opposed to leather?
In regards to, it all comes down to preference. As long as the saddle fits in the areas that it should, it can be made out of anything. It could be made out of, pineapple leather or whatever. It doesn't matter.
Okay.
As long as the tree is able to support the rider properly and flex properly to absorb impact based on the rider's weight and, not create localized pressure points, it doesn't matter about the rest. The only thing I'll say is to make sure that whatever material you're using is safe. That means the billets, that they're not going to snap on you. That means that, any part of the saddle that is directly related to your safety, be it, the billets or the stirrup bars or the stirrup leathers, just make sure those are safe. And that's it. Okay. Everything else, it can be whatever.
Sweet. So, once again, we're here at trees. Pros and cons of treed saddles versus treeless. I actually just watched a video from Schleza on their YouTube about treeless and bareback stuff. So if anybody's interested in that video's out there. But on just how not effective it is, and the bareback pads that are supposed to distribute your weight just physically can't. Also due to what we were talking about earlier with your like the female pelvis, it's just not possible really to ride comfortably and well in a way for both horse and rider. And my black stallion dreams were crushed. I was like, this is so sad to me. But what are your thoughts?
So I'm going to preface this by saying that I don't support treeless. However, if someone is sort of in between saddles and they're trying to, somewhat rehab their horse, treeless can work temporarily.
Okay.
And the emphasis is on temporarily. So I'll go back in history a little bit on why the tree was made. It was made to help stabilize the rider and specifically distribute the weight of the rider and not cause pain or damage to the horse. Full stop. That's why the tree was made. Mm-hmm. So in order to protect the horse, make sure they can move properly, don't put them at risk for injury, discomfort, or, catastrophic accident because they can't utilize their body in the manner that they should. I would say that, every single person should ride in a treed saddle. That being said, riding bareback is better than riding in a saddle that is completely inappropriate for your horse.
Right.
And a lot of the comments that we get, especially on our Facebook page, is, the horse went poorly in a treed saddle and then went beautifully bareback or in, a treeless saddle. And I'll say that every single component of saddle fit that we look at affects a different area of the horse. And each of those components will cause a different reaction. So if you have a saddle that, pinches the withers, causes atrophy in the trapezius, and, clips the shoulder, of course the horse is going to move better when you take that away.
Right.
You're essentially taking away the handbrake. But that doesn't mean that the horse is moving better per se. He's moving freer in the shoulder, freer in, the neck. But what about his back? Is he lifting properly, or are, the pressure points created by the rider's seat bones preventing that?
Right, and it's what we talked about before we jumped on the call, that it's just like, it's relative. So you're riding in a poorly fitted saddle, the horse is not doing well, you take the saddle off, and now you're riding bareback. The horse is moving now, period, full stop. The horse is moving. Is it better comparatively, or is it just now able to actually move? And if you were to put on a well-fitted treed saddle, would it then be even better than the bareback? Most likely. So I see where the logical fallacy is in that argument, that just, well, my horse is better when I'm bareback, or better when I'm in a bareback or treeless saddle pad or whatever. And then it's like, well, but did you actually have a saddle that fit or not? It might not be just 1 + 1 = 2 in this situation. Correlation does not equal causation. Just because a treed saddle was there doesn't mean that tree saddles are bad. It's the fit.
Yeah, exactly. And I'll say sort of the hierarchy goes fitted saddle, slightly fitted saddle, bareback, very bad saddle.
Right. Okay, so are there any differences you want to cover about English versus Western saddles? And is the gullet size generally the same? Like if say Zoe was to have a dressage saddle and a Western saddle, would the gullet width need to be the same, or no?
So the gullet width should always be about a fist. And in Western saddles, we almost never run into the issue of the gullet being too narrow. It's mostly an English saddle issue where you see the gullet is way too narrow.
Okay. All right. Then let's move into our misconceptions here, our last little section, finally. So is it true that a saddle that fits well can go straight onto the horse without any saddle pads? And my guess from what you've said is that saddle pads are there just to keep it clean.
Pretty much, yeah. You can use, although we don't recommend it, especially for sensitive horses, a saddle without a pad. Mm-hmm. It's there to protect the leather.
Okay. So should you ride in a new saddle without pads so that it can shape to the horse's body, or does the pad not affect it?
So a saddle that is fitted doesn't need to be shaped or, molded anymore. It fits. So just ride with it with, a regular pad that has, the wither relief in the front.
Right. If anything, I've heard that, saddles over time, instead of shaping to the horse's body, because it's not something that's necessarily controllable. It's on an organic moving organism. So the wool might get displaced or moved around, or the foam might become compacted and stuff. So it's not, almost don't want it to shape change in any way. More so just stay on top of the maintenance, right?
And that's pretty much why another reason you want your saddle checked regularly, because wool does settle. And depending on how you store your saddle, a lot of people don't store them correctly. You can actually have the rails of a saddle stand cause indents in the flocking.
Right. Which is another facet of frustration in my life. So is there any other myth that you'd like to debunk regarding saddle fit?
There's so so many. I can't really think of anything off the top of my head. We briefly did discuss sort of, the confusion around asymmetry and why you wouldn't put a symmetrical saddle on an asymmetric horse. What else is there? I'm not sure I know of anything else. Does anything come to the top of your head?
I'm trying to think about any myths that I know of or what people tend to think about saddles. I honestly can't think of anything else. That's why I asked you.
Oh, I have one. So
okay.
This is a particular school of thought where they say you should put the saddle 2 to 4 inches behind the shoulder blade.
Okay.
Now, you've done some of the course, and you know how small that saddle support area is on most horses.
Right. That's no bueno.
Let's use my wonderful mare as an example. So she's 15 inches. Let's say I put the saddle 4 inches back. I now have 9 inches. I don't even think my own butt alone would fit into 9 inches.
Right.
Let alone a saddle.
Yeah, that doesn't make any sense at all. The only other thing that I can think of is that just like it's hard to articulate, but that all rider postural error is the rider's responsibility, and that to me, if I had a trainer that was constantly barking at me to pull my heel back or pull my lower leg down, or to lean more right or lean more left because I'm off kilter or I'm dropping a hand or something, that would be, at this point, a sign that my saddle is something's off. And that's about all I've got. Do you have any thoughts on that?
A lot of rider posture issues are from the saddle, and it's the same as if I were to throw you into a lazy boy. You can't help but sort of sink in and sink back. Right. And I feel bad for a lot of riders because they're being made to feel like they can't ride their horse. They can't move with their horse. They can't, especially with canter. So many riders cannot sit the canter, and it's not their fault.
Mm-hmm. And then you end up with the trainer yelling at you.
You are only as good as...
Sorry, there's a delay.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was just saying that you end up with, you're already trying to compensate and move with your horse correctly and do all of the things right, and then you've got a trainer barking at you telling you that you're not doing it right, you need to relax and soften, and you're like, I physically can't relax and soften into the saddle without damaging myself or hurting my back in some way, and it's just a big self-defeating cycle, isn't it?
It really is. And I mean, you're only as good as your equipment allows you to be, just like skating with dull skates. Mm-hmm. It causes a lot of riders to lose, faith in themselves and their ability, and, really beat down on themselves. It's like, no, it's not you.
Right.
It's your saddle.
Yeah, and I think that circles back to the point about, bareback, and another myth around that might be that it's more natural to ride bareback. But to what you were saying about the whole purpose of developing a tree or a saddle itself to put on a horse was to improve horse and rider performance so that they weren't inhibited in any way to move in unison and be able to shoot the enemy or get to the new place faster. It was designed to make an improvement. It's not going against nature. It's to help both. Which, like I said, ruins my black stallion.
And to be
dreams.
fair, riding horses is not natural.
Right. So even though it's your picturesque moment to be cantering bareback on the beach, maybe once in a blue moon, but not commonly.
Yeah. No.
So our last couple of topics here are what to do if you have multiple horses and you're on a budget. How on earth do you accommodate that without, sacrificing the horse's well-being or your well-being? How on earth?
So there are a few saddles that you can purchase, English and Western, where as long as you get the measurements of each horse, they'll tell you what adjustments to make between horses so that it can fit. And that can be anywhere from, adjustments that you can make yourself to the tree, and then the inclusion of shimming or shimming alone.
Okay.
There are some saddles where where the panels come off, and you can have, instead of, one saddle per horse, you have one set of panels per horse, but the same saddle that it fits to.
That's cool. And I know that, you guys at Saddlefit for Life aren't partial to any one brand, but are you aware of which brands offer those options? Because I personally can only think of like one.
It's the one that you're thinking of, and I really just don't want to say it.
Okay. All right. That's fair. So we're about science here, not marketing. Okay. So do you have any other tips that you'd like to mention about getting saddles when you are on a budget? Because let's face it, yes, you need to factor in the cost of a saddle to the horse, but not everyone can have as big of a budget factored into that cost. So what's the best way you think to go about finding a saddle that fits your horse on a budget?
So the very first thing you want to do before you look at any saddle, have your horse measured. And there are a lot of fitters out there who will do like wither measurements and so on. The measurements that you want, and that are done by fitters that are certified through us, are shoulder angle and width, length. Those are the top three that you essentially want to know.
Mm-hmm.
And once you have, like, if you were to call out a fitter that was certified through us, you would essentially get an entire sheet, which is a report on everything your horse needs, everything you need, and that you can use to find a saddle that is suitable. Not, having someone come out and saying, oh, your horse needs a medium. It's like, well, what the hell does that mean?
Right.
If you call out someone that is certified through Saddlefit for Life, they're not going to say medium one. They're going to say this measurement, these numbers, that exact number.
Right. So
you're not left guessing, what the hell do you mean by medium? You know exactly, oh, my horse needs, a 67 degree angle with whatever width.
Right.
So first and foremost, find out what your horse needs.
Yeah.
Plain and simple.
And I as I'm selling a couple saddles between me and my boss at the moment, it's not difficult to ask sellers to go take a tape measure and measure what you need, and you could probably find a graphic online or draw it yourself on what exact measurements you need, and then you can compare it to your horse. If you don't have the option to just like go to the saddle shop and pick one, because I know for me in Arkansas, we're predominantly Western out here, and most of the people don't really care what goes on their horses' backs as long as they can sit in it. So it's difficult to, I can't just walk into a tack shop and pick a saddle. I have to do it over the internet for the most part. So as somebody who is selling saddles and has had to measure countless and questionable parts of saddles, you can ask and people will usually supply, because saddles are hard to get rid of. So if you get interest, sellers will pretty much give you any measurement you need. So.
And if you don't have a fitter in your area, like I said before, give us a shout. We will help you. We'll walk you through step by step.
Awesome. Yeah. So I guess in closing, is there one particular thing that you want everyone listening to know about Saddlefit?
I would say that, it doesn't have to be expensive. Custom is not the be all end all. And Saddlefit is really a core component of, overall horse health and horse care. It's not an extra that a lot of people consider it to be. If you want your horse to be healthy, be happy, continue to be a willing partner and to really build longevity into them, have a saddle that fits you and your horse.
Awesome. Yeah, I think that is the core message of this now approaching 2-hour-long podcast.
Oh my God.
I'm watching the timer and I'm like, oh, poor Sonja, you've been talking for so long.
Oh, that's okay. I'm always happy to, provide information.
Sweet. Well, we'll probably have you back on then and extort that. So, is there something that you're really interested in tackling, like a big goal coming up or one that you've just accomplished? What's next?
Honestly, for me, my main goal and the mission of the company is to get our education out there and have how we fit be sort of like the standard, the global language of saddle fitting.
Yeah.
We want everyone to really respect what the horse needs. It's not taking a horse and trying to fit it to this saddle, that saddle. It's taking the horse and understanding what it needs and finding something suitable for it. Yeah. It's preventing pain, all of the injuries, all of the discomfort. It's avoidable. To see a horse go around in visible pain, I don't want to see that anymore. Yeah. I don't want to see saddle sores. I don't want to see, more instances of kissing spine. I don't want horses who, are put in all manner of gadgets because they're misbehaving when really the horse is just desperately trying to tell the rider, something hurts, something is wrong. Please listen.
Right. And, it's regarding kissing spine, obviously that's something that's very near and dear to my heart at this moment. I listen to a lot of podcasts and webinars over experts on kissing spine and vets talking about it. And it seems to be that the consensus is that kissing spine is a congenital issue and it's inherited. And, I've heard several vets, and I'll preface this by saying who am I to argue with a vet? But I just have a really hard time believing that the only way a horse can get kissing spine is if it's genetic. Just knowing Zoe, she might be predisposed to it, but, the way that she went around for years with her back hollow and her back arched and just piddling out behind with her, her hind legs and ending up with hock issues because of a compensatory issue. And then, I really struggle to believe that the saddle or the rider and weight distribution has any, or just doesn't have any effect on the development of kissing spine. And I don't mean to say weight as in, heavy riders will give their horse kissing spine, not that. But, even me, I could give my height and weight, but I'm a bigger person. So to be on a horse with a very small saddle support area in a saddle that doesn't have any support, you end up creating a lot of issues and localized pressure, and then the horse drops out from under you, and then they go around for years competing with their backs hollow, and it just seems to me like it would be nearly impossible for their back not to try to adapt via kissing spine. Do you have any thoughts on that? Or, I don't know, it just seems like it can't only be congenital.
So the vets that we worked with, the ones that did a whole bunch of dissections, they mentioned that, when there's irregular tension placed on bone or even cartilage, what the body does is it deposits more bone there to create stability. Mm-hmm. So in the case of a horse who is dropping away from pressure or discomfort, as the bone or as the spinal dorsal spinous processes rub together, the body sees that as a trauma and instability. So what they'll do is, between it rubbing together, it'll deposit more bone there to prevent it, mm-hmm. to sort of glue everything together. Stabilize and we don't only see that in the thoracic vertebrae, but we also see bone deposits in the cartilage on the shoulder as well, especially when you have a saddle that really doesn't fit the shoulder width or angle. And so to say that, majority of kissing spine is hereditary, I find it difficult just understanding the biomechanics of the horse and how, they've done standing x-rays of horses where they cause the horse to engage and then to drop away, and you see the processes come together and spread apart. Mm-hmm. It's hard for me to, agree in that it is mostly hereditary, especially seeing how most horses go around with the back dropped, right, which brings everything together. It's like I can't understand how that wouldn't be a very severe contributing factor to it.
Right. And I agree. And I mean, it's not to say to put anyone down that is talking about that. I mean, these are professionals that have researched it, and I know that they found it in very young horses. But to me, it feels more like that's a lack of muscular development. And perhaps kissing, I mean, this is my like armchair theory, but that kissing spine is something more natural than we think. And since we're just now gaining more information on it, I mean, I imagine it's like humans. If you overflex your back and push your belly button way forward and pull your shoulders back, you're gonna impinge something, especially if you have weight pressing there, and then the compounded effect of gravitational pull. I mean, like it doesn't make sense from a physiological standpoint for me that it wouldn't affect. And my armchair theory is that it's a political thing, that you can't out people for bad training or having improper fitted tack and weight ratio, and that it's just easier to say it's hereditary because that doesn't make, I mean, to me, that just doesn't make sense.
A portion of it is hereditary, and
Of
the
course.
problem with saying, with ousting people for, not having properly fitted tack is, again, it goes back to, well, what's the standard? Mm-hmm. What constitutes properly fitted? Because it varies depending on who you ask.
That's a good point. Not even so just
it seems like an easier answer as opposed to actually diving into, well, what makes a good fit? What constitutes it? What parameters?
Yeah.
Does it need to fall into for it to be good?
And then from a research perspective, you have to delve into, okay, well, what fit types are causing it, if it is. And yeah, that seems like a lot of work even to me. But I have a hard time believing that Saddlefit has no effect on the development of kissing spine. I think that it absolutely can be a contributing factor at the very least. I mean, even if Zoe was or wasn't predisposed, I don't really think it matters. I think that the management alone and the equipment I used, I think that played a massive role in it. So is
honestly, I want riders to be open to understanding Saddlefit, knowing that it can be quite an uncomfortable conversation to have with themselves. They're going to find problems, but it's not the end of the world. Understanding that your saddle doesn't fit and, seeking the guidance of, us or whoever else, it leads you onto a path of making it better. But to simply ignore it, you're going to do a lot of damage to your horse that you can't undo. And, even for people who are okay with, a poorly fitted saddle, saying that, they'll get chiro or whatever after, it's money cannot buy back time that you've lost with your horse.
Yeah.
And it can't buy more time either. So the time that you have with your equine partner, make the most of it, even if it means having difficult conversations and having, uncomfortable situations where you might feel like there's nothing you can do. Just, admitting to yourself that there is a problem is the first step, and then seek out the help of people in your area, seek out the help of, Saddlefit for Life or, one of our fitters, and start on the path. At the very least, just begin. Start having the conversation. Your horse will thank you.
Yeah, I think that's a great message to leave it on. So with that, thank you, Sonja, for coming on and talking to everyone. I think that this has been a very informative episode, and I'm excited to get it out.
Yes, me too. It's been fun, and I can't wait to come back.
Yeah, so is there anything that you want to plug, anywhere you'd like to direct people?
If you want to learn, there is so much information on our Facebook page, all free. We have videos, posts, we have, full webinars on there as well. For anyone who really wants to dive a little more into saddle fitting education itself, you can visit us at saddlefitforlifeacademy.com. We have all manner of courses, obviously the big one is the certified equine ergonomist, or, if you just want to dabble in a few topics, you can do that as well. But another thing that I just want to mention is we have a conference where we had several guest speakers, everything from breeding to, myofascial trigger points to being a compassionate equestrian. If it's all on there and you can access it anytime. And we're constantly adding new courses, so do check back on a regular basis, because the catalog of courses is always getting bigger.
Yeah, you guys just did a massive revamp of the equine ergonomist program, and it looks incredible. So, yeah, I think we'll leave it with that. So I'll thank you again, and I'll catch you next time.
Okay, take care.
You too. Alrighty, guys, that is the episode. I hope you learned something and enjoyed it. Oh my God, it's so much information. I can tell you straight up, I will be listening to this episode several times to really process all of that. Sonja is amazing at conveying a bunch of different points that old Jill hadn't considered about Saddlefit. So hopefully you learned something new, or it made you think about something in a different way and didn't stress you out too badly about ensuring that your saddle fits you and your horse. But yeah, as always, as we said several times in the episode, feel free to reach out to either of us, and I will get you in contact with them if necessary, or you can reach out to them directly. And yeah, be sure to check us out on the socials, and I will see you guys next week. Have a good one.